Before we begin, take a slow breath and let the world around you quiet down. Tonight, you will travel through the 9 realms, guided by the gentle whisper of Yggdrasil, the ancient world tree whose roots and branches connect all of existence. Allow its calm presence to lead you into a peaceful journey beyond time, where every realm welcomes you with serenity. The breath of the world tree. In a place beyond ordinary geography, in a realm that existed alongside the mortal world but separate from it, in a space where myth and reality wove together like threads in an eternal tapestry, there stood a tree unlike any other that had ever grown or ever would grow. Yggdrasil, the world tree, the axis around which all existence turned, the living column that connected earth and sky, past and future, the known and the unknowable. It was not simply large, though its size defied comprehension, its trunk wider than mountains, its branches reaching into realms beyond sight. It was not simply old, though it had stood since before time was measured, had witnessed the birth of gods and the shaping of worlds, had been present at the beginning and would remain until the end, if end there ever was. No, Yggdrasil was something more fundamental than size or age could capture. It was alive in a way that transcended ordinary life, conscious in a manner that went beyond mere awareness. It was the embodiment of connection itself, the physical manifestation of the principle that all things were linked, that nothing existed in isolation, that every realm and being and moment was part of a vast web of relationship that extended infinitely in all directions. And on this particular evening, though evening meant something different here, where time flowed according to its own rhythms, the world tree was breathing, and its breath moved through the cosmos like a gentle wind, carrying with it an invitation, a calling, a whisper that reached across the boundaries between worlds to touch those who were ready to hear it, who needed to hear it, who would benefit from the journey it offered. You stood at the edge of a forest that was both familiar and strange, both part of the mortal world and separate from it. The trees here were ancient oak and ash, pine and birch, but they grew with a straightness and majesty that suggested divine influence, that spoke of proximity to something sacred, something that elevated everything around it simply by existing. The air was cool but not cold, carrying scents of earth and bark, of moss and distant rain, of everything that made forests smell the way they did but intensified, purified, made more essential. And through this air moved something else, a presence, an awareness, a sense of being gently observed not with judgment but with patient interest, with the kind of attention that made you feel seen, truly seen, in a way that was both humbling and comforting. Ahead, between the trees, you could see something that shouldn't be possible, that defied the normal rules of perspective and distance. A trunk, impossibly massive, rising from earth that seemed to descend forever, climbing toward sky that seemed to have no ceiling. Its bark was deeply furrowed, creating patterns that looked like ancient runes, like maps of territories no mortal had ever explored, like the recording of all knowledge written in a language that existed before words. This was Yggdrasil. You knew it without being told, recognized it with certainty that came from somewhere deeper than rational thought, deeper than learned knowledge, from some place in your consciousness that remembered, that had always known, that was simply being reminded rather than discovering something new. As you looked at the world tree, you felt something shift inside you, a loosening of tension you hadn't realized you were carrying, a settling of anxiety that had become so familiar you had stopped noticing it, a sense of rightness, of being exactly where you needed to be, of having arrived at a destination you hadn't known you were seeking. And then you heard it, the whisper. It came not from any specific direction but from everywhere at once, carried on the wind that moved through the forest, through the leaves that rustled high above, through the very air that filled your lungs with each breath. It was not words exactly, or if it was words, they were in a language that bypassed the thinking mind and spoke directly to something deeper, something that understood without needing to analyze or interpret. The whisper was welcoming, inviting, gentle as a hand offered in friendship, as a door opened in hospitality, as a path revealed to a traveler who had been walking in circles. It spoke of rest and discovery, of peace and wonder, of a journey that would be unlike any you had taken before but which you were ready for, which had been waiting for you, which would change you in ways you could not yet imagine but which would be exactly what you needed. Come, the whisper seemed to say. Come and walk through the realms. Come and see what has always been here but which you have not yet witnessed. Come and learn what the world tree knows, what the 9 realms teach, what peace can be found in understanding that you are part of something vast and ancient and enduring, that you are not separate or alone but connected, always connected, to everything that is. You moved forward, drawn by the whisper, guided by something that felt like instinct but was perhaps older, perhaps wiser, perhaps the accumulated knowledge of all who had walked this path before, who had accepted this invitation, who had made this journey and been transformed by it. As you approached the world tree, its scale became even more overwhelming. The trunk you had seen from a distance was revealed to be just one aspect of something far more complex, roots that spread across the ground like the veins of the earth itself, branches that reached into what might have been sky or might have been other dimensions, leaves that rustled with sounds like distant chimes, like whispered prayers, like the voices of all who had ever lived singing in harmony. At the base of the trunk, where root met ground, you saw something that made you pause, an opening, a space between roots, a passage that led somewhere. It glowed faintly with light that was warm and inviting, that suggested safety and welcome, that promised discovery without danger, wonder without fear. This was the way in. The entrance to the journey. The threshold between the world you knew and the realms that waited, connected by the world tree, accessible to those who were called, who were ready, who needed what they would find there. You stepped toward the opening, and as you did, you felt the world tree's presence more strongly. It was not threatening or overwhelming but deeply comforting, like being noticed by someone wise and kind, someone who saw you completely and accepted what they saw, who understood without needing explanation, who welcomed without demanding justification. The roots formed steps downward, rough but stable, easy to navigate, clearly meant to be walked upon. You descended, one step and then another, moving from the ordinary forest into something else, something that existed adjacent to normal reality but operated according to different principles, where magic was not fantasy but simply another aspect of existence, where the impossible was commonplace and the miraculous was expected. The passage was lit by that same gentle glow, no torches or lanterns but simply luminescence that seemed to come from the wood itself, from the living tissue of the world tree, from the life force that flowed through it and connected all the realms it touched. As you descended, you heard the whisper again, closer now, more distinct, though still not quite words, still not quite sound in the ordinary sense. It was encouragement, was reassurance, was the equivalent of a gentle hand on your back, guiding you forward, supporting your steps, ensuring you would not stumble, would not fall, would not lose your way. The passage opened into a space that defied easy description. It was inside the tree, you understood that, but it was also somehow larger than the tree, contained more space than should be possible within even such a massive trunk. The walls were wood but also something else, glowing, shifting, seeming to breathe with the same rhythm as your own breathing, creating a sense of perfect synchronization, of harmony between yourself and this place, between your awareness and the consciousness of the tree itself. At the center of this space, you saw something that might have been a well or might have been a pool or might have been something else entirely, a source of water, certainly, clear and still, reflecting light in ways that created patterns of beauty that were mesmerizing without being hypnotic, that drew attention without demanding it. This was the heart of Yggdrasil, or one of its hearts, for a tree this vast and complex surely had many centers, many sacred spaces, many points where its life force concentrated and could be accessed, could be felt, could be experienced directly rather than just inferred. You knelt beside the water, and as you looked into its surface, you saw not your own reflection but something else, glimpses of other places, of realms beyond this one, of the 9 worlds that Yggdrasil connected, that existed separately but were bound together by the tree, that were distinct but related, different expressions of the same underlying reality. You saw golden cities and green meadows, bright gardens and dark forests, high mountains and deep caverns, places of light and places of shadow, all of them part of the pattern, all of them necessary, all of them connected by this tree, by this water, by the breath that moved through all things and maintained the balance, that ensured the whole remained whole even as its parts expressed their individual natures. The whisper came again, and this time you understood its invitation more completely. You were being offered a journey through these realms, a chance to walk through the 9 worlds, to experience what they held, to learn what they taught, to find in each one some gift, some wisdom, some aspect of peace that together would create a complete understanding, a whole awareness, a state of being that was more settled, more centered, more at home in existence than you had been before. And you understood that this was safe, that the journey would be gentle, that you would be protected by the world tree itself, guided by its whisper, supported by its presence, that nothing harmful would touch you here, that you could explore without fear, could discover without danger, could open yourself to experience without needing to defend or protect or guard against threat. The water before you shimmered, and in its depths, you saw a path forming, a way forward, a route through the realms, beginning somewhere above, in a place of light and gold, in the first of the 9 worlds that awaited your exploration. You reached toward the water, and as your fingers touched its surface, you felt yourself lifted, carried, transported not physically but in some other way, moved from this heart space of the world tree into the first realm, into the place where the journey would truly begin. And as you moved, as you transitioned, as you allowed yourself to be carried by forces you didn't fully understand but somehow trusted completely, you heard the whisper one more time, and it said something that might have been words or might have been simply feeling, but which you understood perfectly. Be at peace, traveler. The world tree holds you. The 9 realms welcome you. And what you seek, though you may not know what it is, you will find before this journey ends. Trust. Open. Receive. And let the breath of Yggdrasil carry you where you need to go. Asgard, the realm above the clouds. The transition was gentle, seamless, like waking from one dream into another. You felt yourself rising, ascending through the world tree's vast structure, moving upward along pathways that existed more as intention than as physical space, carried by the breath of Yggdrasil toward the highest of the 9 realms, toward the place where gods dwelt, where the divine made its home among clouds and sky. And then you were there, standing on ground that was solid beneath your feet yet somehow also ethereal, as though you walked on crystallized air, on clouds given just enough substance to support weight but maintaining their essential lightness, their quality of belonging more to heaven than to earth. Asgard spread before you, and it was nothing like the harsh realm of battle and conflict that mortal stories often depicted. This was not a place of war or struggle, not a fortress prepared for violence, not a realm defined by opposition and defense. Instead, what you saw was a city, no, more than a city, a sanctuary, bathed in the softest morning light, golden and warm, that seemed to come not from the sun but from the very air itself, from the essence of this place that generated its own illumination, that needed no external source because it was itself a source, a wellspring of light and beauty. The architecture was magnificent but not overwhelming, grand but not oppressive. Buildings rose in elegant curves and sweeping arches, their walls made of materials that seemed to be part stone, part light, part something else entirely, substance that existed at the boundary between physical and spiritual, between matter and energy. They glowed faintly, these structures, pulsing with a gentle rhythm that might have been the heartbeat of the realm itself, that created a sense of being in the presence of something alive, something aware, something that welcomed your presence. Golden roofs caught the ambient light and reflected it in soft gleams, creating patterns of brightness that moved across walls and pathways like water flowing, like wind made visible, like joy given physical expression. Columns rose with perfect proportion, supporting structures that seemed almost to float, that appeared to defy gravity not through magic but through perfect balance, through design that understood principles so deeply that what should be impossible became natural, became inevitable, became the only way things could possibly be. Between the buildings were gardens unlike any you had seen before. Trees grew here, not the massive scale of Yggdrasil but still larger than mortal trees, more vital, more alive, their leaves shimmering with colors that shifted as you watched, now green, now gold, now silver, now shades that had no names in human languages. Their branches spread in patterns that were both organic and geometric, demonstrating that nature and mathematics were not opposites but partners, that beauty emerged when both were honored, when neither dominated but both contributed. Flowers bloomed in beds and borders, their colors vivid but not harsh, bright but not overwhelming. They seemed to emit their own soft light, as though they contained tiny stars within their petals, as though they were not just reflecting the ambient illumination but contributing to it, participating in the creation of this realm's gentle radiance. And everywhere, on every path, in every courtyard, throughout every garden, there was peace. A profound, palpable peace that was not merely the absence of conflict but a positive presence, a quality that filled the air, that touched everything, that made violence and strife seem not just unwelcome but impossible, incompatible with the fundamental nature of this place. You walked along a pathway of white stone, smooth and cool beneath your feet, and as you moved deeper into Asgard, you began to encounter its inhabitants, the gods themselves, the beings who made this realm their home, who shaped it and were shaped by it, who were both its creators and its expression. But they were not as you might have imagined them. There were no warriors brandishing weapons, no stern figures radiating intimidating power, no displays of might or dominance or superiority. Instead, you saw gods in moments of quiet reflection, of peaceful rest, of gentle contemplation. One sat beneath a tree, eyes closed, hands resting in lap, engaged in what might have been meditation or prayer or simply the act of being still, of existing without purpose or goal, of resting in awareness itself without needing to do anything with that awareness. Another walked slowly through a garden, pausing occasionally to examine a flower, to touch a leaf, to simply observe with complete attention, with the kind of presence that honored what it perceived, that made even simple observation an act of reverence, of celebration, of gratitude for existence and its infinite expressions of beauty. Two more sat on a bench overlooking what might have been an ocean of clouds, speaking in voices too soft for you to hear, their conversation clearly not about matters of great import or cosmic significance but simply the sharing of thoughts between friends, the comfortable exchange that happens when beings know each other well enough that words are not performance but connection, not display but communion. None of them seemed troubled or burdened. None carried the weight of responsibility or duty that mortal imagination often attributed to divine beings. Instead, they appeared at ease, at rest, at peace with themselves and with existence, demonstrating that even gods, perhaps especially gods, understood the necessity of stillness, of taking time to simply be rather than constantly doing, of honoring rest as much as action. As you walked, you became aware of sounds that created a subtle music throughout the realm. Wind chimes hung from eaves and branches, their tones soft and melodious, creating harmonies that seemed to resonate with the underlying frequencies of the realm itself. Distant harps played melodies that were barely audible but which added to the overall atmosphere of tranquility, of gentle beauty, of peace made audible. Water flowed in fountains and streams, its sound adding another layer to the sonic landscape, the splash and gurgle of falling water, the quiet murmur of brooks running over smooth stones, the occasional drip of moisture from leaves where morning dew had gathered and was now returning to earth, completing its small cycle, fulfilling its particular pattern. And through it all, barely noticeable but unmistakable once you became aware of it, was the breathing of Yggdrasil, a vast, slow respiration that moved through this realm and all others, that connected everything, that reminded you that even here, in the highest realm, you were still within the world tree, still part of its living structure, still held in its awareness and care. You found yourself drawn to a particular courtyard, more intimate than the grand spaces you had passed through, enclosed by walls covered in flowering vines, centered around a small reflecting pool whose surface was so still it created a perfect mirror of the sky above, of the buildings around it, of everything that existed in this peaceful moment. You sat on the edge of the pool, and as you did, you felt the peace of Asgard settling into you more deeply. The constant mental chatter that usually filled your awareness, the planning and worrying, the replaying of past conversations and rehearsing of future ones, the endless stream of thoughts that characterized normal consciousness, began to quiet, to slow, to give way to something more spacious, more open, more present. Here, in this place, you understood something you had perhaps known intellectually but had never felt so directly, that peace was not something to be achieved or earned or created through effort, but something to be allowed, to be received, to be open to when conditions were right, when the environment supported it, when the quality of space and time and presence aligned in ways that made resistance unnecessary, made defense pointless, made striving counterproductive. You simply sat, breathing the golden air of Asgard, feeling its peace permeate your being, allowing yourself to rest in a way you perhaps had not rested in a very long time, not the rest of sleep, which was unconscious, but the rest of deep awareness, of being fully present while also being completely at ease, of consciousness that was both alert and relaxed, both engaged and resting. Time passed, though time seemed to function differently here, to flow according to quality rather than quantity, to expand or contract based on experience rather than moving at some fixed rate. It might have been minutes or hours that you sat by that pool, but it didn't matter, because in this moment you were outside the tyranny of clocks, free from schedules and obligations, present in an eternal now that was sufficient unto itself, that needed nothing added to be complete. Eventually, you became aware of a presence nearby. You turned to see a figure approaching, one of the gods, though which one you couldn't say, for they appeared neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but somehow beyond such categories, existing in a state that transcended the binaries that usually defined mortal perception. They sat beside you without asking permission, comfortable in a way that suggested they belonged here as completely as the stones or the water or the flowering vines, and they were silent for a time, simply sharing the space, the moment, the peace that pervaded everything. When they finally spoke, their voice was gentle, carrying the same quality as the ambient sounds of the realm, the wind chimes and flowing water, the distant harps and rustling leaves. "You are welcome here, traveler. Yggdrasil brings few to Asgard in these times, but those it does bring are always those who need what we can offer." You didn't respond immediately, didn't feel the need to fill the silence with words, and the divine being beside you seemed to appreciate this, seemed to understand that sometimes the appropriate response to peace is not to speak but to simply receive it, to honor it with presence rather than commentary. "This realm teaches many things," they continued after a time, "but perhaps the most important is this, that even the highest existence, even the most powerful beings, need rest. Need stillness. Need moments when nothing is demanded, when nothing must be done, when it is enough to simply be, to exist without purpose beyond existence itself." They gestured to the courtyard around you, to the gardens visible beyond it, to the whole of Asgard spreading outward. "This is not a realm of constant battle, despite what your stories say. Yes, we have known conflict. Yes, we have struggled and striven. But that is not the truth of what we are, not the essence of our existence. This," they indicated the peace, the beauty, the gentle golden light, "this is our natural state. This is what we return to, what sustains us, what makes all else possible." The words settled into you like seeds planted in fertile soil, taking root, beginning to grow into understanding that went beyond the words themselves, that touched something deeper, that shifted perspectives you hadn't known needed shifting. You sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, and then the divine being rose, placed a hand briefly on your shoulder, a touch that conveyed blessing, encouragement, acknowledgement, and walked away, leaving you alone again with the reflecting pool and the golden light and the peace that seemed inexhaustible, that seemed to be an intrinsic property of this realm rather than something that could be depleted or used up. Eventually, you too rose, knowing without being told that it was time to continue the journey, that Asgard had given you what it had to offer, that other realms waited with their own gifts, their own teachings, their own particular expressions of the wisdom that the world tree maintained across all the 9 worlds. As you walked back toward the pathway that would lead you onward, you carried Asgard's peace with you, felt it integrated into your being in ways that would persist, that would remain accessible even when you left this place, that would serve as a reminder that peace was always possible, always available, always present somewhere within reach if you remembered how to stop, how to breathe, how to simply be still and allow it to find you rather than chasing after it, trying to capture or create, or force it into existence. The breath of Yggdrasil rose around you, and you felt yourself being lifted again, being carried toward the next realm, toward the next stage of your journey through the 9 worlds, grateful for Asgard's gift, ready for whatever came next, trusting in the world tree's guidance, in the gentle inevitability of the path you were walking, in the wisdom of the ancient patterns that shaped all things and ensured that what was needed would be provided, that what was sought would be found, that peace, once touched, would never be completely lost. Midgard, the calm earth below. The descent from Asgard was like exhaling after a deep breath, a gentle release, a settling downward, a return to something more familiar yet somehow also transformed by what you had just experienced. The golden light faded gradually, replaced by something warmer, more earthly, the kind of illumination that came from an actual sun moving across an actual sky, creating shadows and highlights, marking the passage of time in ways that felt both ancient and immediately recognizable. You found yourself standing on solid ground, real earth, dark and rich, smelling of moisture and growing things, of everything that made soil alive rather than just dirt. Grass grew beneath your feet, green and lush, soft as a carpet that had been woven by nature's patient hands over countless seasons. And around you stretched a landscape that was, in many ways, the most familiar of any realm you had visited or would visit, for this was Midgard, the middle realm, the world of humans, the place that mortals called home. But it was Midgard as it could be, as it perhaps once was, as it might be again if humanity remembered certain truths that had been forgotten in the rush toward complexity, toward speed, toward the constant doing that characterized modern existence. This was not the Midgard of cities and traffic, of concrete and steel, of noise and hurry and the endless consumption that defined contemporary life. This was something older, simpler, more connected to the fundamental rhythms that governed existence before those rhythms were drowned out by human activity. Meadows spread before you, their grasses rippling in a gentle breeze that carried scents of wildflowers and distant rain, of hay being dried in summer sun, of everything clean and growing and alive. The meadows were not uniform or manicured but varied, some areas thick with tall grasses that swayed like ocean waves, others shorter and dotted with flowers in colors that created a living tapestry, patterns that were both random and somehow perfect, demonstrating that beauty emerged naturally when things were allowed to be themselves without excessive intervention or control. Through the meadows wound a river, its water clear and bright, catching sunlight and throwing it back in glints and sparkles that danced across its surface. The river moved with unhurried purpose, neither rushing nor stagnant, maintaining the perfect flow that characterized healthy waterways, fast enough to stay fresh, slow enough to nurture life, constant enough to be reliable but varied enough to remain interesting. You walked toward the river, drawn by the sound of water moving over stones, by the promise of coolness on a warm day, by the simple attraction that water holds for consciousness, the way it calls to something deep in all living things, reminding them of origins, of the womb-like environments where life began, of the fact that everything that lives carries ocean inside itself, maintains that ancient connection to fluid, to flow, to the medium in which existence first stirred and took form. At the river's edge, you knelt and cupped water in your hands, bringing it to your lips. It was cold and pure, tasting of minerals and distance, of the mountains where it was born and the journey it had taken to reach this place, of everything it had touched and everything it would touch before finally reaching the sea and beginning the cycle again. Evaporation and cloud formation, rain and runoff, the endless circulation that meant water was never truly lost, only transformed, only moved from one place to another, one form to another, maintaining its essential nature while expressing it in infinite variations. As you drank, you became aware of other presences in the landscape, humans, but humans living differently than most did in your world, your time. They moved through the meadows with a quality of attention and care that was rare in modern life, harvesting herbs and gathering flowers not with the intensity of commercial production but with the mindfulness of those who understood they were taking gifts from the earth, who felt gratitude for what was provided, who took only what was needed and left more than enough for seeds and roots and future growth. A woman passed not far from where you knelt, carrying a basket filled with something, greens, perhaps, or medicinal plants, and she noticed you, paused, offered a smile that was genuine and warm, that contained no suspicion or wariness, that suggested a world where strangers were not threats but simply people you hadn't yet met, where trust was the default rather than something that had to be earned. "The river is good today," she said, her voice carrying easily across the distance between you, though she didn't raise it, didn't shout, simply spoke in a normal tone that somehow carried because the environment was quiet enough to allow it, because there was no competing noise to drown out human speech or require it to be louder than was natural. "It is," you agreed, though you had no basis for comparison, no knowledge of whether this was better or worse than other days, but understanding that she was simply making connection, acknowledging shared experience of this place, this moment, this simple pleasure of being beside clean water on a beautiful day. She smiled again and continued on her way, and you watched her go, noticing how she moved, not hurrying but also not dawdling, walking at a pace that seemed perfectly natural, that suggested someone who had nowhere to be except where she was, who understood that the journey was the destination, that moving through the world with presence and attention was itself the goal rather than simply a means of getting from one place to another. You rose and began to walk along the river, following its course through the meadows, and as you walked, you became aware of how your own breathing was synchronizing with the rhythms around you, with the flowing water and the swaying grasses, with the movement of clouds across the sky and the slow turning of the sun on its arc from east to west. Your heartbeat seemed to match some underlying pulse, some fundamental tempo that governed this place, that connected all its elements in patterns of relationship and resonance. The path alongside the river led you gradually upward, climbing gently toward higher ground, and as you rose, you could see more of Midgard spread around you. There were forests in the distance, dark green expanses that promised cool shade and the sounds of birds, that looked inviting rather than threatening, that suggested exploration and discovery rather than danger or getting lost. There were fields where crops grew in ordered rows but not in the monoculture that characterized industrial agriculture. Instead, different plants were mixed together in ways that seemed both intentional and organic, demonstrating knowledge of companion planting, of how certain species supported each other, of the wisdom of diversity over uniformity, of working with nature rather than trying to dominate or control it. And there were dwellings, simple structures that appeared to grow from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it, built from local materials and styles that had evolved over generations to suit local conditions, to work with rather than against the climate and geography, to provide shelter without cutting inhabitants off from the world around them. Smoke rose from chimneys, speaking of fires for cooking and warmth, of homes occupied, of families going about their daily lives in ways that were ordinary yet also, from your perspective, extraordinary in their simplicity, their connectedness, their apparent freedom from the anxieties and complications that characterized existence in your world. The path brought you to the crest of a hill, and here you paused, sitting on a large stone that might have been placed there specifically as a resting spot or might simply have been present, waiting, part of the landscape offering itself for whatever use suited the moment. From this vantage point, you could see Yggdrasil in the distance, its massive trunk rising like a pillar holding up the sky, visible from even this realm, connecting Midgard to all the other worlds, demonstrating the principle that nothing existed in isolation, that the human realm was not separate from divine or natural or any other kind of existence but was woven into the same fabric, part of the same pattern, expression of the same underlying unity. The sight of the world tree from this perspective filled you with a sense of both smallness and significance. Small because clearly you were just one tiny part of an incomprehensibly vast whole, one consciousness among countless others, one brief moment in an eternal flow. but significant because you were part of that whole, because your existence mattered not in some grand cosmic sense but in the simple fact of being included, of belonging, of having a place in the pattern, even if that place was modest, even if your role was small. You sat and breathed and watched the world below, the river continuing its flow, the meadows swaying, the smoke rising from chimneys, the people moving through their days with that quality of presence and care you had noticed, living in ways that seemed aligned with something fundamental, something that modern life had perhaps lost or forgotten but which could, you sensed, be remembered, be reclaimed, be brought back into awareness and practice. This was Midgard's gift, you understood. Not some exotic wisdom or supernatural experience, but something simpler and perhaps more precious, the reminder that peace was possible in ordinary life. That connection to nature and to each other didn't require abandoning civilization but simply relating to it differently, more mindfully, with more awareness of consequences and relationships, with more attention to the present moment rather than constant focus on future goals or past regrets. The breeze moved across the hilltop, carrying with it all the scents of Midgard, grass and earth, water and growing things, smoke and hay, everything that made this realm what it was. And in that breeze you felt again the breath of Yggdrasil, the subtle presence that connected all the realms, that would soon carry you onward to the next stage of your journey, to the next world with its own gifts and teachings. But for now, this moment, you remained on the hilltop, looking out across Midgard, feeling its peace settle into you as Asgard's had before it, a different kind of peace, more earthly, more grounded, more connected to the practical realities of existence, but peace nonetheless, real and sustaining and available not just here in this idealized version of the human realm but potentially anywhere, anytime, whenever you remembered to slow down, to pay attention, to connect with the rhythms that had always been present, waiting to be noticed, waiting to be honored, waiting to guide you back to balance, back to harmony, back to the simple wholeness that was your birthright as a living being on a living world held in the branches of a tree that connected everything, that ensured nothing was ever truly lost or separate or alone. You rose eventually, knowing it was time to continue, and you descended the hill with steps that felt lighter than before, carrying Asgard's peace and now Midgard's as well, integrated into your being, changing you in subtle but significant ways, preparing you for whatever realms still waited, whatever wisdom still needed to be received, whatever transformation this journey would ultimately complete when all 9 worlds had offered their gifts and the world tree had woven them together into something complete, something whole, something that would allow you to return to your ordinary life profoundly changed, blessed by realms beyond the ordinary, carrying within you the breath of Yggdrasil and the peace of the 9 worlds, ready to live differently, more consciously, more connected to the vast web of existence in which you had always been embedded but which you were now beginning to truly see, truly feel, truly understand. Vanaheim, the garden of fertility and peace. The transition from Midgard to Vanaheim was marked not by a dramatic shift but by a gradual intensification, as though everything that had been present in the human realm was amplified, concentrated, brought to a fuller expression of itself. The green became greener, the air became sweeter, the sense of life and growth and abundance became so palpable it was almost a physical presence, almost something you could touch, could taste, could feel settling over your skin like warm rain. And indeed, rain was falling, but such rain as you had never experienced before. It was soft, gentle, barely more than a mist that drifted down from clouds that hung low and luminous, glowing from within with light that might have been sunlight filtered through countless water droplets or might have been the clouds' own radiance, their essential nature made visible. The rain was warm rather than cold, caressing rather than pelting, and it smelled of summer and growing things, of earth drinking deep after long thirst, of seeds swelling and roots reaching deeper, of everything that rain represented when it came as blessing rather than as burden or inconvenience. You walked through this gentle rain, and it did not soak you or chill you but simply touched you, left tiny droplets on your skin and in your hair that caught light and created tiny rainbows, that felt like benediction, like the realm itself welcoming you, acknowledging your presence, offering its particular form of hospitality. Vanaheim spread around you in waves of abundance. This was a realm dedicated to fertility in all its forms, not just the reproduction of plants and animals but the broader principle of thriving, of flourishing, of life expressing itself fully and joyfully, of abundance that flowed from deep alignment with natural principles, from understanding and working with the patterns that governed growth and nourishment and renewal. The fields here were lush beyond description. Crops grew in such profusion that they seemed almost to overflow their boundaries, to press against each other in their eagerness to grow, to reach toward light and draw up nutrients, to fulfill their essential nature as completely as possible. Wheat stood tall with heads so heavy with grain they bent the stalks, creating waves of gold that moved in the breeze like a living sea. Vegetables grew to sizes that seemed almost magical, pumpkins like boulders, tomatoes like apples, everything expressing maximum potential, everything demonstrating what could happen when conditions were perfect, when care was consistent, when the fundamental requirements of growth were met without constraint or limitation. But this abundance did not feel excessive or grotesque. It felt natural, felt like the logical result of proper tending, of deep understanding, of relationship between grower and grown that went beyond mere technique and entered the realm of communion, of genuine connection that allowed plant and tender to work together toward shared goals, toward mutual flourishing. You walked between the fields, marveling at the sheer vitality of everything, and as you walked, you became aware of the beings who inhabited this realm, the Vanir, gods of fertility and abundance, spirits of growth and nourishment, divine presences who embodied the principles that made Vanaheim what it was. They moved through the fields and gardens, tending crops with movements that were both practical and graceful, that demonstrated deep knowledge combined with genuine care, that showed how work could be something more than mere labor, could be art, could be prayer, could be celebration of existence expressed through the act of helping other life flourish. One of them noticed you and approached, a figure whose appearance seemed to shift slightly depending on how you looked at them, now appearing more male, now more female, now something beyond either category, demonstrating perhaps that divine beings were not constrained by the binaries that defined mortal existence, could express themselves in whatever form suited the moment, the need, the particular quality of connection being offered. They smiled as they drew near, and it was a smile of genuine warmth, of welcome without reservation, of someone who saw joy in sharing their realm with a visitor, in having their work and their world appreciated by new eyes. "Welcome to Vanaheim," they said, their voice carrying the same gentle quality as the rain, as the soft sound of growing things, as everything that spoke of nourishment and care. "I am Freya," she said, for now the form had settled into something more consistently female, though still with that quality of fluidity, of not being entirely fixed, and I would be honored to show you something of our home. You walked together through the gardens, and Freya pointed out various plants, explaining not just what they were but what they represented, what principles they embodied, what lessons they taught to those who paid attention. "This is borage," she said, indicating a plant with star-shaped blue flowers. "It grows everywhere it's welcomed, asks little, gives much. Its leaves nourish the soil even as it lives, and when it dies, it enriches further. It teaches the principle of giving while living, of contributing to the whole even as you pursue your own growth. She led you to another area where beans climbed poles in spiraling patterns. These work with bacteria in their roots to pull nitrogen from air and fix it in soil, making it available for other plants. They demonstrate partnership, showing how some beings can take what seems empty air and transform it into nourishment that benefits the whole community. Everywhere you looked, every plant had its story, its role, its particular way of contributing to the overall abundance. Nothing was wasted, nothing was excluded, everything fit into patterns of mutual support and shared flourishing that created the profound vitality characterizing this realm. Freya led you eventually to a glade, a circular clearing surrounded by fruit trees whose branches hung heavy with apples and pears, plums and cherries, everything ripe and perfect, ready to be harvested, waiting to fulfill its purpose by nourishing whoever came to gather, to receive what was offered. In the center of the glade was a simple shelter, open-sided, its roof woven from living vines that still grew, still reached toward light, still bore flowers that released sweet perfume into the rain-soft air. Beneath this shelter were cushions and low seats, clearly meant for rest, for gathering, for taking time to simply be in this place of abundance without needing to work, to produce, to do anything beyond receiving what was offered. Sit, Freya invited, and you both settled onto the cushions, comfortable, at ease, the gentle rain continuing to fall around you while the shelter kept you dry, created a space that was both part of the landscape and separate from it, both within the rain and protected from it. For a time, you sat in comfortable silence, listening to the soft patter of rain on leaves, to the distant sound of water running in streams, to the subtle rustle of growing things responding to moisture, swelling, expanding, drinking deep and using what they drink to fuel further growth, further expression, further manifestation of their essential nature. Vanaheim teaches abundance, Freya said eventually, her voice quiet but clear, but not the kind of abundance that comes from taking more than you need or accumulating more than you can use. This is the abundance of proper relationship, of understanding what nourishes and being willing to both give and receive nourishment, of knowing that fertility, true fertility, comes from cycles of giving and receiving that benefit all parties, that create more than they consume, that generate surplus not through exploitation but through genuine care and understanding. She plucked an apple from a nearby branch, its skin red and gleaming with rain, and offered it to you. You took it, felt its weight, its firmness, the life it still contained even though it had been separated from the tree. When you bit into it, the flavor was extraordinary, sweet and tart simultaneously, complex, layered, tasting of sunshine and rain, of soil and season, of everything that had contributed to its creation. This is what we offer, Freya said, watching you eat. The understanding that the world wants to nourish you, wants to support your growth, wants to see you flourish. Not because you've earned it or because you're special, but simply because that's the nature of existence when it's properly aligned. It generates abundance, creates surplus, produces more than enough for all who come to receive. She paused, then added, but receiving requires openness, requires willingness, requires releasing the belief that you must struggle for everything, must fight for every scrap, must hoard and protect and defend against scarcity. Vanaheim demonstrates that scarcity is often illusion, is often created by wrong relationship, by taking without giving, by consuming without nourishing, by breaking the cycles that naturally generate abundance. You finished the apple, and the nourishment you felt was more than physical. Something in you relaxed further, Some knot of fear or anxiety around resources and support loosened and began to unwind. The realm's peace, different from Asgard's golden stillness or Midgard's grounded presence, settled into you, bringing with it a sense of trust, of confidence that what was needed would be provided, that the universe was fundamentally generous when approached with right relationship, with gratitude, with willingness to participate in the cycles of giving and receiving rather than trying to hoard or control. The rain began to lighten, the clouds starting to break, and through the gaps appeared sunlight, warm and golden, creating that particular quality of light that comes after rain, when everything is washed clean and the air is clear and colors seem more vivid than usual, more themselves, more fully expressed. Freya stood, and you rose with her. "The realm has more to show you," she said, "but I sense your journey calls you onward. Other worlds wait, each with their own gifts, their own wisdom. But remember this, you are meant to flourish. Not to merely survive, but to thrive. And the world, when properly related to, wants to help you do that." She embraced you briefly, a gesture of blessing and farewell, and you felt in that touch the warmth of Vanaheim, the nourishment it offered, the abundance it represented. Then she released you and stepped back, smiling, radiating satisfaction at having shared her realm, her understanding, her particular expression of divine care. The breath of Yggdrasil rose around you once more, and you felt yourself being lifted, being carried toward the next realm, toward the next teaching. But you carried Vanaheim with you, its abundance, its trust, its understanding that flourishing was natural and scarcity often illusion, that the world wanted to nourish those who knew how to receive, who understood the cycles of giving and receiving, who could participate in the great patterns of mutual support that characterized existence at its best, at its most aligned, at its most true to the principles that governed growth and life and the endless expressions of fertility in all its forms. Physical, emotional, spiritual, creative, all of it flowing from the same source, all of it available to those who knew how to open, how to receive, how to trust in the fundamental generosity of a universe that had created them and wanted to see them thrive. Alfheim, the realm of soft light. The transition to Alfheim was like stepping from afternoon into eternal dawn, or perhaps eternal dusk, that liminal time when day and night existed simultaneously, when the quality of light was neither bright nor dark but something in between, something softer, something that seemed to emanate from the air itself rather than from any visible source. You found yourself standing in a forest, but such a forest as existed nowhere else in any realm. The trees here were slender and graceful, their trunks pale as birch but smoother, almost luminous, seeming to glow faintly from within. Their bark had an opalescent quality, shifting colors as you moved, as light played across it, now silver, now gold, now the palest green or blue or rose, creating the impression that the trees were not entirely solid but were somehow made of condensed light, of illumination given just enough substance to stand upright, to reach toward sky, to create the vertical elements that defined forest from meadow. The leaves were extraordinary. Each one seemed to contain its own light source, glowing gently, creating a canopy overhead that was like standing beneath countless tiny lanterns, beneath a ceiling of soft illumination that cast no harsh shadows but simply bathed everything in gentle radiance. The leaves moved in a breeze you could barely feel, rustling with sounds like distant chimes, like whispered music, like the voices of stars if stars could sing. And floating through the air, moving between the glowing trees, drifting on currents that were more than merely wind, were motes of light, tiny points of brilliance, each one perhaps no larger than a firefly but somehow more substantial, more present. They moved in patterns that seemed almost choreographed, swirling and spiraling, gathering into constellations that would hold for a moment before dissolving and reforming into new arrangements, creating living art, demonstrating that beauty could be dynamic, could be constantly changing while remaining essentially itself. You walked deeper into this luminous forest, and the soft light surrounded you, touched you, seemed to seep into you through skin and breath, through eyes and ears, through every sense that was open to receive it. The light was not just visual but somehow emotional, spiritual, carrying with it a quality of peace that was different from what you had experienced in other realms, more refined perhaps, more subtle, more delicate, like the difference between a full orchestra and a single flute playing a simple melody that somehow contained everything the orchestra had expressed but in concentrated, essential form. As you walked, you became aware of presences moving through the forest, beings that were both there and not there, solid and transparent, visible and somehow beyond visibility. The Alfheim, the light elves, the inhabitants of this realm who embodied its essential nature, who were expressions of the principle of refinement, of subtlety, of beauty that existed at the edges of perception, that revealed itself only to those who learned to see in ways beyond ordinary sight. They moved with extraordinary grace, these beings, their movements so fluid they seemed to float rather than walk, to glide through the forest as though unbound by normal physical constraints. They wore garments that seemed woven from the same light that illuminated everything else, flowing, shimmering, creating trails of soft radiance as they moved. Their faces were beautiful but not in a way that was intimidating or distant, beautiful in the way that art is beautiful, in the way that music is beautiful, in the way that perfectly captures something essential, something true, something that touches the heart without needing to dominate or overwhelm. One of them noticed you and approached, moving closer without seeming to actually walk, simply becoming nearer through some method you couldn't quite perceive. Up close, you could see that their eyes held depths that seemed infinite, seemed to contain entire universes of light, seemed to see not just your surface but your essence, your core, the fundamental truth of what you were beneath all the layers of personality and history and accumulated experience. "Welcome, traveler," they said, their voice like wine through the glowing leaves, like water over polished stones, like everything soft and musical and gently beautiful. You walk in Alfheim now, where light reveals what remains hidden in darker realms, where truth shows itself to those who have learned to see with more than eyes. They gestured for you to follow, and you walked together through the luminous forest, your companion pointing out aspects of the realm that you might have missed, that became visible only when attention was directed toward them. "Notice how the light here doesn't cast sharp shadows," they said. "This is because we understand that truth is rarely absolute, is rarely entirely one thing or another, but exists in gradations, in subtle variations, in the spaces between extremes. Light and dark are not opposites here but partners in revealing different aspects of reality." You looked and saw that they were right, objects had shadows, but they were soft, diffuse, creating gentle contrast rather than harsh division, demonstrating that boundaries could exist without being rigid, that differentiation didn't require opposition. Your guide led you to a river, if river was the right word for what you saw. Water flowed, certainly, but it was water like liquid light, transparent and luminous, reflecting the glowing trees and floating moats while also somehow generating its own illumination, adding to rather than just receiving the ambient radiance. The river's surface showed perfect reflections, but the reflections were not quite identical to what they reflected. They were softer somehow, more idealized, as though the water showed not just what was but what could be, what existed in potential, what might manifest if conditions aligned properly. Alfheim teaches about inner light, your guide said as you both sat beside the river, watching its gentle flow, observing the play of light on water and water on light in endless recursive patterns. Every being carries illumination within themselves, but in many realms, in many lives, this inner light becomes obscured, hidden beneath layers of pain or fear, beneath accumulated hurts and defensive patterns, beneath the belief that they are fundamentally dark, fundamentally broken, fundamentally lacking. They reached down and touched the water, and where their fingers contacted the surface, ripples of light spread outward, creating patterns that were mesmerizing in their beauty, that demonstrated how a single touch could affect an entire system, could create beauty that extended far beyond the initial action. But the light is always there, they continued. Always present, always waiting to be remembered, to be allowed back into awareness. Our realm exists partly to remind travelers of this truth, that beneath everything else, at your core, you are light, you are awareness, you are consciousness that is fundamentally luminous, fundamentally clear, fundamentally whole and unbroken regardless of what experiences you've accumulated, what stories you've told yourself about who and what you are. The words settled into you like the light itself, penetrating deeply, touching places that had been dark, illuminating corners of your inner landscape that you had perhaps been avoiding, that you had learned to navigate around rather than through. And in that illumination, you saw not flaws or failings but simply what was neutral, acceptable, part of the totality of what you were without being the whole of it, without defining or limiting you. Your guide stood and gestured for you to rise as well. There is something I would like to show you, they said, and they led you to a particular tree, larger than the others, its trunk wide enough that several people could have joined hands around it, its branches spreading to create a canopy that was like a cathedral ceiling of living light. At the base of this tree was an opening, a doorway of sorts, and your guide indicated that you should enter. You did, stepping through into a space that was both inside the tree and somehow much larger than the tree, a chamber that existed in dimensions beyond the merely physical, that demonstrated how space could be expanded, could contain infinities within finite boundaries when the right principles were understood, when magic, or perhaps just very advanced knowledge, was applied properly. The interior of the tree space was filled with soft light that came from nowhere and everywhere, that illuminated without casting shadows, that revealed without harsh examination. And in this light, you saw yourself. Not a reflection, not a projection, but something more essential, an image of your own inner light, your own core luminosity, showing you what you looked like when all the accumulated layers were stripped away, when only essence remained, when truth was revealed without filter or distortion. And you were beautiful. Not in a conventional sense, not in ways that could be compared to others or judged by external standards, but beautiful in the way that all true things are beautiful, in the way that authenticity is always beautiful, in the way that seeing clearly is always satisfying regardless of what is seen. This is what you are beneath everything else. Your guide's voice came from behind you, gentle, affirming. This light, this awareness, this fundamental clarity. Everything else, all the pain and fear, all the stories and defenses, all the accumulated weight of living, these are like clothes you wear, like masks you've adopted. They're not wrong or bad, they serve purposes, but they're not who you fundamentally are. They're what you've experienced, what you've used to navigate existence, but beneath them, this remains, unchanging, undiminished, always present, always waiting to be remembered. You stood in that light, seeing yourself truly perhaps for the first time, and something profound shifted. Not everything, you didn't suddenly become enlightened or transcend all difficulty, but a foundation changed, a core understanding updated, and you knew that you would carry this vision forward, would be able to access it when needed, would remember that beneath the surface chaos and complexity, this essential light remained, this fundamental okayness persisted, this core wholeness was always available if you remembered to look, to turn inward, to see past the surface to what lived at the center. Eventually, you emerged from the tree space, and your guide was waiting, smiling with understanding and satisfaction at having helped you see what needed to be seen, at having facilitated this recognition, this remembering. The lesson of Alfheim, they said as the breath of Yggdrasil began to rise around you again, preparing to carry you toward the next realm, is that you are light. Always have been, always will be. And knowing this, truly knowing this, not just intellectually but in your bones, in your heart, changes everything. Not because it makes life's challenges disappear, but because it provides an unshakable foundation, a core truth that cannot be diminished by circumstances, that remains constant regardless of what storms pass through your experience. The light of Alfheim intensified for a moment, blazing up in a final gift of illumination, burning this truth into your awareness so it could never be completely forgotten, so you would always have access to it, always be able to return to this vision of your own essential nature when the world tried to convince you that you were something else, something less, something broken or damaged or fundamentally flawed. And then you were moving again, carried upward and onward, toward the next realm and the next teaching, grateful for Alfheim's gift, changed by its light, carrying within you now not just the peace of previous realms but this deeper understanding, that at your core, you were luminous, were clear, were whole, and that this truth would remain regardless of what came next, would be available always as a resource, as a refuge, as a reminder of what you truly were beneath all the accumulated layers of living. Jotunheim, the still mountains of the giants. The transition from Alfheim's luminous forest to Jotunheim was marked by a profound shift in scale and temperature. The soft, warm light gave way to something cooler, clearer, sharper, the light of high altitudes and open spaces, where air is thin and sky stretches vast and blue above landscapes that dwarf human comprehension. You found yourself standing on stone, ancient stone, cold and solid, that had existed since the world's beginning and would remain until its ending. Around you rose mountains of such immensity that they seemed less like features of landscape and more like the pillars holding up the sky itself, like the bones of the earth made visible, like manifestations of the principle of permanence, of endurance, of existence that operated on timescales so vast that mortal lifespans were briefer than single breaths. But these mountains were not threatening. Their size was not oppressive but somehow liberating, demonstrating that you were part of something so much larger than yourself that your small concerns, your personal anxieties, your individual sufferings became contextualized, became visible as temporary ripples on an ocean of existence that was fundamentally stable, fundamentally enduring, fundamentally untroubled by the surface disturbances that characterized daily experience. The mountains were covered in ice and snow, brilliant white expanses that caught the clear light and threw it back in glints and sparkles, in reflections and refractions that created a landscape of such purity it seemed almost abstract, seemed to exist at the boundary between physical reality and mathematical principle, between matter and idea. And everywhere was silence. Not the warm silence of quiet rooms or peaceful forests, but the vast silence of spaces too large to hold sound, where any noise would be swallowed immediately by sheer volume, would be absorbed by distances too great to be crossed by mere vibration, would vanish into immensity leaving only stillness, only the profound quiet that existed before sound was invented, that would remain after all voices had ceased, You walked across the snow, and your footsteps made no sound, or if they made sound, it was so small, so quickly absorbed, that it might as well have been silence. The snow crunched beneath your feet, you could feel the compression, could sense the displacement, but the sensation was divorced from auditory confirmation, creating a strange experience of action without acoustic consequence, of movement through a world that existed beyond sound, that operated according to principles where noise was irrelevant, where only size and stillness mattered. As you walked, snowflakes began to fall, large and perfect, drifting down with lazy grace, each one a unique crystalline structure, a demonstration of nature's endless creativity, of the principle that even in repetition there was variation, that even in following rules there was individuality, that pattern and uniqueness were not opposites but partners in creating the infinite diversity that characterized existence. The snowflakes landed on your outstretched hand, and you examined them in the clear light, tiny six-pointed stars, intricate and delicate, so complex that it seemed impossible they had formed naturally, spontaneously, through nothing more than water freezing in air, following physical laws that somehow produced art, that somehow created beauty without intention, without planning, without consciousness directing the process. And yet here they were, perfect and temporary, lasting only moments before body heat melted them back to water, demonstrating another principle, that beauty need not be permanent to be real, that temporary was not the same as meaningless, that something could be profound even if brief, significant even if fleeting. Ahead, through the falling snow, you saw movement, a figure approaching, though approaching was perhaps the wrong word, for the movement was so slow, so deliberate, so unhurried that it seemed less like someone walking toward you and more like the mountains themselves shifting, like landscape rearranging itself, like geography deciding to take a different form. The figure grew larger as it neared, or perhaps it had always been that large and you simply hadn't perceived the scale correctly, hadn't understood what you were seeing until it was close enough for your mind to process the reality that this was a giant, an actual giant, a Jotun, one of the beings who inhabited this realm, who embodied its principles of vastness and endurance, who demonstrated that consciousness could exist at scales far beyond the human, could operate on timeframes that made years seem like seconds, that made individual lives seem like heartbeats. The giant stopped before you, and you had to crane your neck back to see their face, which was weathered like cliff stone, ancient and patient, marked by time in ways that somehow made it more beautiful rather than less, that showed how age could bring dignity, could bring peace, could bring a settledness that youth with its urgency and anxiety could never achieve. "Little traveler," the giant said, and their voice was like distant avalanches, like wind moving through canyons, like the slow grinding of glaciers, deep and resonant and carrying the weight of ages. "You walk in Jotunheim now, where time moves slowly and all things find their proper scale." They knelt, a movement that took what seemed like minutes, that was like watching a mountain decide to become a hill, and brought their face closer to yours, close enough that you could see their eyes, which were glacier blue, clear and deep, holding calm that came from having witnessed everything and being troubled by nothing, from understanding that all things passed, that nothing was permanent except change itself, that the only constant was the slow turning of great cycles. "We are the keepers of perspective," the giant continued, their voice softer now but still carrying that fundamental depth. "We remind the universe that not everything happens quickly, that not all change is immediate, that patience is not just a virtue but a necessity, that some processes cannot be rushed without being ruined, that depth requires time. That true understanding comes only to those willing to wait, to observe, to allow patterns to reveal themselves at their own pace." The giant gestured to the mountains around you, to the vast expanses of ice and stone. Look at this landscape. It was not made in a day, or a year, or even a millennium. Ice inches forward over centuries, carving valleys grain by grain. Stone withers slowly, breaking down bit by bit, returning to soil that will feed future growth. Nothing here hurries. Nothing here forces. And yet everything happens, everything changes, everything moves toward its inevitable transformation, simply by being what it is, by allowing time to do what time does. You stood in the presence of this giant, feeling the truth of their words settling into you, feeling how your own hurried nature, your constant rushing, your anxiety about time and deadlines, and the feeling that you were always behind, always late, always not doing enough fast enough, how all of that seemed suddenly less real, less substantial, when viewed from the perspective of these mountains, these giants, this realm that operated on scales so vast that human lifetimes were barely noticeable. Were like snowflakes falling and melting in the same breath. The giant reached out one enormous hand, and with surprising gentleness, they touched your forehead with a single finger that was larger than your head. The touch was cool like ice but not cold, solid like stone but not harsh, and in that moment of contact, you felt something shift in your perception of time itself. You saw your life from a larger perspective, saw how the things that seemed urgent and overwhelming in the moment would, given enough time, resolve themselves or become irrelevant, would be forgotten or would transform into something else, would prove to be less permanent than they appeared in the heat of immediate experience. You understood, suddenly and completely, that rushing did not make things happen faster, that anxiety did not make outcomes better, that the constant pressure you put on yourself to do more, be more, achieve more was not helping but hindering, was not accelerating growth but preventing it, because real development required time, required patience, required the willingness to move at the pace that was appropriate for what was developing rather than at the pace your fear demanded. Rest in slowness, the giant said, removing their finger, stepping back. Allow time to pass without trying to control it. Trust that what needs to happen will happen at the right pace, not too fast and not too slow, but exactly as it should when all factors are considered, when all elements are allowed to move at their natural speed rather than being forced into rhythms that don't suit their nature. The snowfall intensified slightly, and the giant began to move away, their form becoming less distinct as distance and falling snow created a veil between you. But their final words carried clearly across that distance, remember the mountains, traveler. Remember the ice. Remember that what endures moves slowly, that what lasts is not hurried, that patience is not passive but active trust in the wisdom of proper timing. And then they were gone, or perhaps they had simply become mountain again, had returned to being landscape rather than entity, demonstrating perhaps that the distinction was artificial anyway, that giant and mountain were simply different expressions of the same principle. Different manifestations of the same fundamental truth about scale and time and the peace that came from accepting that you were small and temporary and that this was not a problem but simply reality, simply the way things were, and there was profound relief in accepting it rather than constantly fighting against it. You stood alone in the falling snow, in the silence of mountains, and you felt lighter than you had in longer than you could remember. The pressure to hurry, to achieve, to prove yourself through constant doing, all of it seemed suddenly optional, seemed like a choice you had been making without realizing you were making it, a pattern you could step out of simply by remembering that time was vast, that you had more of it than fear told you, that even your entire lifetime was just one snowflake falling through Jotunheim's eternal winter. Beautiful and unique and meaningful precisely because it was temporary, precisely because it would melt and return to the cycle, precisely because it did not last forever. The breath of Yggdrasil rose around you, carrying with it the understanding that your time here was complete, that Jotunheim's teaching had been received, that other realms still waited. As you felt yourself being lifted, being carried toward the next stage of the journey, you looked back once more at the vast mountains, at the endless expanses of ice and stone, and you whispered a quiet thank you to the giants, to the landscape, to the profound stillness that had given you permission to slow down, to trust time, to stop rushing through existence and instead allow yourself to move at the pace that was right for you, for your growth, for the unfolding of whatever you were meant to become. Nidavellir, the Ember-Forged Caverns. The descent from Jotunheim's cold vastness to Nidavellir's warm depths was a journey from ice to fire, from external expansiveness to internal intimacy, from the slow patience of mountains to the focused attention of craftwork. You felt yourself sinking through layers of earth and stone, moving downward but not into darkness, instead into a warm, amber glow that grew stronger as you descended, that spoke of fire contained and put to purpose, of heat that served rather than destroyed, of flame that created beauty rather than consuming it. You emerged in a cavern, but it bore no resemblance to the cold, damp caves of the surface world. This space was warm and dry, illuminated by forge fires that burned in alcoves carved into the walls, casting everything in shades of gold and orange and deep red, creating an atmosphere that was both dramatic and profoundly comforting, like being in the heart of autumn, like sitting beside a hearth on a cold evening, like every warm and welcoming space concentrated and perfected. The cavern was vast but felt intimate, its ceiling high enough that you couldn't quite see where it ended in the amber-lit shadows above, but its walls close enough to create a sense of enclosure, of safety, of being held within the earth's embrace rather than exposed to the universe's vastness. Stalactites hung like chandeliers, catching firelight and throwing it back in glints and gleams, and the stone walls themselves seemed to glow, as though they had absorbed centuries of forge heat and now released it slowly, creating the ambient warmth that made this underground realm feel more alive than many surface places. The sound that characterized Nidavellir was unlike anything you had heard in other realms. It was rhythmic but not mechanical, musical but not quite song, the sound of hammers on anvils, of metal being shaped, of craft being practiced with such skill that the work itself became art, became meditation, became something that transcended mere production and entered the realm of creation, of bringing into existence what had not existed before. As you walked deeper into the cavern complex, following passages that branched and interconnected in patterns that suggested both intentional design and organic growth, you began to see the inhabitants of this realm, the dwarves, master craftspeople, beings whose existence was dedicated to the principle of making, of shaping raw materials into objects of beauty and function, of transforming potential into actuality through knowledge and skill and patient attention. They worked at forges and benches, at anvils and wheels, their movements efficient but unhurried, demonstrating the kind of focus that came from complete absorption in task, from being so present with what you were doing that nothing else existed, that time ceased to matter, that there was only the work, the material, the slow revelation of form from formlessness. But what struck you most was the peace in their activity. This was not frantic labor, not work driven by deadlines or demands, but craft practiced for its own sake, for the satisfaction of making something beautiful, something useful, something that would outlast its maker and carry forward into the world as a gift, as a contribution, as evidence that consciousness could shape matter, could influence reality, could participate in the ongoing creation of beauty and meaning. One of the dwarves noticed you and set down their tools, They had been working on what appeared to be a small medallion, etching intricate patterns into its surface with tools so fine they seemed barely more substantial than needles. They approached, and you saw that they were perhaps 4 feet tall, broad-shouldered and strong, their hands showing the calluses of long practice, their eyes bright with intelligence and humor and something else, a kind of contentment that came from doing work you loved, from spending your existence creating rather than consuming, from leaving the world richer than you found it. "Welcome to Nidavellir," they said, their voice carrying the deep resonance that came from living underground, from speaking in spaces where sound reverberated, where every word gained weight and depth. "I am Brokkr, and I would be honored to show you something of our craft, if you wish to see." You nodded, and Brokkr led you through the caverns, pointing out various workshops where different dwarfs practiced different specialties, metalworking here, gem cutting there, wood carving in an alcove where the stone had been shaped to channel fresh air from above, glass blowing in a chamber where the heat was most intense and the sand of a particular quality that allowed it to be transformed into crystal of extraordinary clarity. "We make many things," Brokkr said as you walked, "but we do not make weapons. Not anymore. We learned long ago that our skill was better spent creating beauty than instruments of harm, that the same attention that could forge a blade that never dulled could instead shape a cup that brought joy to everyone who drank from it, that our time was better invested in adding to the world's loveliness than to its capacity for destruction." They led you to their own workshop, a space that was clearly personal, that bore the marks of long habitation and deep familiarity. Tools hung on walls in careful arrangement, each one in its proper place, each one maintained and sharp and ready for use. Materials were organized by type and quality, demonstrating a mind that valued order not for its own sake but because organization supported creativity, because knowing where everything was meant you could focus on the work rather than on searching, because external structure freed internal innovation. "Sit," Brokkr invited, indicating a bench, and you sat while they returned to their work on the medallion, their hands moving with practiced certainty, with the kind of unconscious competence that came from doing something so many times that skill became instinct, that technique became invisible, that there was no gap between intention and execution. As you watched them work, you felt something in yourself settling, calming, finding a rhythm that matched the rhythm of their craft. The hammer strikes were like heartbeats, regular, steady, reliable. The careful attention they brought to each detail was like meditation, like prayer, like consciousness focused so completely on present moment that past and future ceased to exist, that there was only now, only this tool, only this metal responding to this particular application of force and heat and patient shaping. "Craft teaches many things," Brokkr said without looking up from their work, their hands continuing their dance of creation, "but perhaps the most important is this, that satisfaction comes not from finishing but from the quality of attention you bring to each moment of the process. A thing well made brings joy not just to those who use it but to the one who made it, because in the making, you are fully present, fully engaged, fully alive in a way that passive consumption can never achieve." They paused, examined their work, made a minute adjustment. "The world tells you that happiness comes from acquiring, from possessing, from accumulating more and more objects, more and more experiences, more and more of everything. But we know differently. We know that true contentment comes from creating, from contributing, from spending your time and energy making things that didn't exist before, that add beauty or function or meaning to the world, that will outlast you and carry forward your care, your attention, your love of craft and quality and doing things properly." The words resonated with something deep in you, touched a longing you perhaps hadn't fully acknowledged, the desire not just to consume but to create, not just to take but to give, not just to experience but to contribute, to leave the world richer for your presence rather than merely using up what was already there. Brokkr set down their tools and held up the medallion, turning it to catch the firelight. It was beautiful, intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow, that created depths impossible in flat metal, that demonstrated how skill and patience could transform ordinary materials into something extraordinary, into art that served no practical purpose except to bring beauty into existence, to create loveliness for its own sake. "This is for you," Brokkr said, offering the medallion. "A charm of tranquility, we call it. It carries no magic except the magic of attention, of care, of the hours spent shaping it with focus and love. When you hold it, remember this place, remember the peace that comes from creating rather than consuming, from making rather than taking, from contributing rather than merely using." You took the medallion, feeling its weight in your palm, feeling the warmth it had absorbed from Forge and from Brokkr's hands, and you understood that this was more than just a beautiful object. It was a physical reminder of a principle, a way of being, a path toward contentment that involved shifting from passive reception to active creation, from being shaped by the world to shaping the world in turn, from feeling helpless to recognizing your capacity to influence, to create, to leave traces of beauty and care that would persist beyond your presence. As you held the medallion, the caverns around you seemed to hum, not with machinery but with something deeper, some resonance that came from stone and fire and the accumulated attention of countless dwarves over countless ages. All of them focused on the same essential task, making things of beauty and quality, contributing to the world's loveliness, demonstrating through their craft that existence could be more than just survival, could be art, could be constant creation of new forms and expressions, could be the ongoing project of adding to reality's richness rather than merely consuming what was already present. The breath of Yggdrasil rose around you, and you felt the familiar sensation of transition beginning, of being prepared to move toward the next realm. Brokkr noticed and nodded, satisfied that their teaching had been received, that their gift had been understood not just as object but as principle, as invitation to participate in creation, to discover the peace that came from focused attention, from craft practiced with love, from work that was more than labor because it was service to beauty, contribution to the world's store of loveliness. "Carry that with you," Brokkr said as the amber light began to shift, as the warm caverns prepared to release you to the next stage of your journey. "And remember, you are not just a consumer, not just a recipient. You are a creator, a maker, someone with capacity to shape reality, to add beauty, to leave the world richer. That capacity is always available, always waiting to be exercised, always ready to bring the peace that comes from creating rather than merely consuming." And then you were moving again, rising from the warm depths, carrying Nidavellir's gift with you, both the physical medallion and the deeper understanding, both the object and the principle, both the reminder and the truth it pointed toward, ready for whatever realm came next, grateful for the peace that had been shown to you here in these amber-lit caverns where craft was practiced with such devotion that it became something sacred, something that transformed both maker and made, something that demonstrated how consciousness could partner with matter to bring new beauty into existence, to add to rather than subtract from, to give rather than just take. Svartalfheim, the Shadowed Haven. The transition from Nidavellir's warm amber to Svartalfheim's cool darkness was gentle, like closing your eyes after staring at flame, like stepping from sunlight into deep forest shade. The warmth faded gradually, replaced by a coolness that was refreshing rather than uncomfortable, that carried scents of earth and moss, of underground streams and ancient stone, of places where sunlight had never reached but which were not therefore dead or empty but simply different, alive in their own way, according to their own principles. You found yourself in a forest unlike any you had seen before. The trees here grew in perpetual twilight, their bark dark as midnight, their leaves, if leaves they were, more like shadows given substance, creating a canopy so dense that no light penetrated from above. Yet the forest was not dark in any threatening sense. Instead, it glowed with its own subtle illumination, bioluminescent fungi growing on tree trunks and fallen logs, phosphorescent moss carpeting stones and earth, flowers that seemed to capture and hold what little light existed, releasing it slowly in soft pulses that created a rhythm, a breathing quality to the darkness itself. The light was mostly blues and greens, purples and silvers, cool colors that created an atmosphere of calm contemplation, of restful shadow, of the kind of darkness that invited sleep rather than awakening fear, that promised restoration rather than threat. It was like being underwater, you thought, or like existing in perpetual dusk, that magical time when day transitions to night and the world exists in between states, belonging fully to neither but partaking of both. As your eyes adjusted, though adjustment seemed the wrong word, as it implied change from one state to another, when really it felt more like remembering how to see in ways you had always been capable of but had simply forgotten, you began to notice the intricate beauty of this shadowed realm. Spider webs stretched between branches, their threads catching the bioluminescent glow and creating constellations of light suspended in darkness. Tiny streams ran through channels carved in stone, their water gleaming like liquid mercury, like moonlight made fluid. And everywhere, the soft glow of living things creating their own illumination, refusing to surrender to absolute darkness, insisting on light even in the deepest shadow. You walked along a path marked by glowing stones, each one pulsing gently, creating a trail that was easy to follow even in the dim light. The ground was soft beneath your feet, carpeted with moss that released a fresh, clean scent when compressed, that felt like walking on velvet, on clouds, on something that existed more as idea than as physical matter. As you walked, you became aware of presences moving through the forest, beings that were part of the shadows themselves, that flowed between trees like darkness given agency, like night deciding to take form. The Svartalfheim, the dark elves, the shadow folk who made this realm their home, who embodied its principles of restful darkness, of peace found not in light but in the comfort of shadow, in the restoration that came from closing eyes, from seeking rest rather than constant stimulation, from allowing consciousness to sink into the depths rather than always striving toward brightness. One of them materialized before you, not suddenly, but gradually, like shadow coalescing, like darkness deciding to concentrate itself into a particular form. They were tall and slender, their form barely distinguishable from the shadows around them, their edges uncertain, as though they existed at the boundary between solid and insubstantial, between matter and pure consciousness. Their eyes, when they opened them, glowed with the same soft bioluminescence that characterized the forest, a gentle silver light that did not hurt to look at, that did not demand attention but offered it, that created connection without intrusion, understanding without demand. "Welcome, traveler," they said, their voice like wine through cave systems, like water dripping in deep places, like all sounds that belong to shadow and silence. You walk in Svartalfheim now, where darkness is not enemy but friend, where shadow offers rest that light cannot provide, where we remember truths that brighter realms often forget. They gestured for you to follow, and you walked together through the glowing forest, your guide occasionally pointing out features you might have missed, a particular fungus whose pattern created fractals of light, a pool whose still surface reflected the bioluminescent canopy above in perfect mirror image, a clearing where the glow intensified slightly, creating a natural gathering place, a space that felt sacred without being defined or bounded. Svartalfheim teaches about necessary darkness, your guide said as you walked. Your world, your time, fears shadow, fears darkness, fills every space with artificial light, creates constant stimulation, never allows consciousness to truly rest, to truly sink into the depths where restoration happens, where dreams are born, where the unconscious mind does its essential work of processing, integrating, making sense of experiences that the conscious mind cannot yet understand. You reached the pool your guide had indicated, and you both sat at its edge, looking into water so still it seemed more like polished obsidian than liquid, like a window into some other realm where everything was inverted, where darkness was foundation and light was accent, where the usual hierarchies were reversed and shadow was valued rather than merely tolerated or feared. Darkness is not absence, your guide continued, their voice soft but clear. It is presence, the presence of rest, of mystery, of potential that has not yet manifested, of seeds sleeping in soil, of dreams forming in sleeping minds, of all that exists before it takes visible form. Light reveals, yes, but darkness protects, nurtures, allows things to develop without being exposed too early, without being forced into manifestation before they are ready. They reached down and touched the water, and where their fingers contacted the surface, ripples of soft light spread outward, not disrupting the darkness but enhancing it, demonstrating how light and shadow could work together, could support each other, could create beauty that neither could achieve alone. Your journey through the realms has shown you many forms of peace, they said, watching the ripples fade. Asgard's golden stillness, Midgard's grounded presence, Vanaheim's nourishing abundance, Alfheim's luminous clarity, Jotunheim's patient vastness, Nidavellir's focused creation. But now you must learn this final truth, that peace also requires darkness, requires the willingness to not see clearly, to not understand completely, to allow mystery to remain mysterious, to trust that not everything must be illuminated, that some things are better left in shadow, allowed to develop in their own time, protected from premature exposure. The words settled into you like the darkness itself, not overwhelming but encompassing, not threatening but comforting, creating a sense that perhaps you had been trying too hard to understand everything, to see everything clearly, to bring light into every corner of your life, when really some things needed to remain in darkness, needed to be allowed to develop unseen, needed the protection that shadow provided. Your guide stood and led you deeper into the forest, to a place where a massive tree grew, its trunk so wide you couldn't see around it, its branches spreading to create a canopy that was like a cathedral ceiling of living shadow. At the base of this tree was a hollow, a space just large enough for one person, lined with moss that glowed very faintly, creating the impression of being inside a living jewel, inside darkness that had texture and depth and subtle beauty. Rest here, your guide said. Allow yourself to sink into darkness without fear, without the need to understand or control, without fighting for clarity or illumination. Simply be in shadow, be held by darkness, be restored by what light cannot provide. This is Svartalfheim's gift, the remembering of how to rest truly, how to allow consciousness to descend rather than always climbing toward light, how to trust that darkness is not enemy but ally, not threat but sanctuary. You entered the hollow, and as you settled into the soft moss, you felt the darkness embrace you, not oppressively but tenderly, like being held, like being rocked, like being returned to some primal safety that existed before light, before seeing, before the need to understand or analyze or remain constantly alert and aware. And in that darkness, you felt yourself letting go of the need to know, of the pressure to understand, of the constant effort to maintain clarity and control. You simply existed in shadow, held by it, restored by it, allowing it to do its work without interfering, without trying to manage or direct the process. Time passed, how much you couldn't say, for in darkness time ceased to have meaning, ceased to flow in measurable increments and instead became quality rather than quantity, became depth rather than duration. You might have rested there for minutes or hours or days, but it didn't matter because in that darkness you were outside time, were in a space where healing happened not through effort but through surrender, through allowing rather than doing, through trusting rather than controlling. Eventually, gently, you felt the breath of Yggdrasil stirring again, calling you back, preparing to carry you toward the final realms of your journey. You emerged from the hollow, and your guide was waiting, smiling with satisfaction at seeing someone who had truly rested, truly allowed darkness to do its work. Carry this with you, they said. Remember that darkness is not failure of light but its own valid state, its own necessary presence. Remember that some things are better left mysterious, that not all questions need answers, that sometimes the deepest wisdom is found not in seeking understanding but in accepting that some things cannot be understood, must simply be experienced, must be allowed to remain in shadow where they can develop naturally, at their own pace, in their own way. As Yggdrasil's breath lifted you toward the next realm, you carried Svartalfheim's peace with you, the peace of shadow, of mystery accepted, of darkness trusted, of the willingness to not see clearly and to find in that not seeing a deeper form of sight, a way of knowing that came not from light but from the depths, from the unconscious, from the vast realms of being that existed beneath and beyond the narrow beam of conscious awareness, ready now for the final stage of your journey, ready to receive whatever last wisdom the world tree had to offer. Helheim, the realm of eternal rest. The transition to Helheim was unlike any before, not an ascent or descent, not a shift in temperature or light, but something more fundamental, like crossing a threshold that existed not in space but in consciousness, like moving from one state of being to another, from the realm of becoming to the realm of having become, from motion to stillness, from doing to simply being. You found yourself standing on the shore of a vast lake whose water was so still it could have been glass, so calm that it reflected the sky above in perfect mirror image, creating the illusion of infinite space, of existing between two heavens, neither up nor down but suspended in balance, in equilibrium, in the perfect center point between opposites. The sky above, and its reflection below, was the color of twilight, that deep blue-gray that exists between day and night, that belongs fully to neither but partakes of both. And hanging in that sky was a moon, full and luminous, casting silver light across the landscape with such gentleness that shadows were barely shadows at all, or more like gentle shadings, like the subtle gradations between one tone and another in a monochromatic painting. The air was cool but not cold, carrying scents of water and stone, of mist and stillness, of everything calm and peaceful and at rest. There was no wind, no movement of air, only perfect stillness, as though the atmosphere itself was holding its breath, as though all motion had ceased and what remained was pure presence, pure awareness, pure existence without the complications of change or transformation. This was Helheim, the realm of death, the place where those who had lived came to rest, to release, to let go of everything they had been and simply exist in the peace of completion, of having finished, of no longer needing to strive or struggle or maintain the constant effort that characterized life. But it was not dark or frightening. There was no sense of punishment or suffering, no feeling of loss or tragedy. Instead, what pervaded the realm was a profound sense of relief, of finally being able to stop, to lay down burdens that had grown too heavy, to cease the endless movement and simply be still, be quiet, be at peace with what had been and what was and what would never need to be again. As you walked along the lakeshore, your feet making no sound on the smooth stones, you became aware of presences nearby, spirits of those who had died, who now dwelt in this place of eternal rest. They appeared as translucent forms, barely visible, more felt than seen, existing at the edge of perception. They moved slowly, peacefully, without urgency or purpose, beyond simple existence, beyond the quiet appreciation of being able to exist without demand, without obligation, without the endless requirements that characterized embodied life. Some sat by the water's edge, gazing at the reflection of moon and sky. Others wandered between mist-shrouded trees that grew in scattered groves, their forms barely distinguishable from the gentle fog. Still others simply stood, perfectly still, engaged perhaps in contemplation or perhaps in nothing at all, simply being present in this place that asked nothing of them except their acceptance, their willingness to let go, their trust that rest, true rest, was possible and was, indeed, the natural conclusion of all effort, all striving, all the complex dance of living. A figure approached from the mist, more solid than the spirits but still carrying that quality of deep calm, of having passed beyond the urgencies that characterized mortal existence. She was tall and dignified, her presence neither welcoming nor rejecting but simply present, simply acknowledging, simply being what she was, the keeper of this realm, the one who ensured that those who came here found the rest they needed, the peace they had earned, the stillness that had been denied them while life demanded constant motion. "I am Hel," she said, her voice carrying no emotion, no inflection, but somehow conveying understanding, acceptance, a kind of compassion that came from witnessing countless endings, countless releases, countless moments when struggling ceased and peace was finally allowed to enter. "And you are still living, still walking the realms in body rather than spirit. But you have been brought here for a purpose, to learn what this place teaches, to understand what death reveals about life." She gestured toward the lake, and you walked together to its edge, looking at the perfect reflection, at the way moon above and moon below created completion, created symmetry, created the sense that what was separated was also united, that what appeared divided was actually whole. "Helheim is not punishment," Hel said, her words simple and direct. "It is rest. It is the place where all effort ceases, where the constant striving that characterizes existence finally ends, where beings can simply be without needing to become anything more, without pressure to grow or achieve or transform. Here, completion is honored rather than judged as failure. Here, endings are understood as necessary rather than feared as loss." She knelt and touched the water, and where her fingers met the surface, ripples spread outward slowly, disturbing the perfect reflection, creating movement that gradually stilled, demonstrating how even in this place of ultimate rest, small movements could occur. Small changes were possible, but always returning to stillness, always coming back to the fundamental peace that characterized the realm. Living beings fear death because they mistake it for annihilation, for loss of self, for terrible ending, Hel continued. But death is simply rest. It is the period at the end of the sentence, the silence after the song, the stillness after the dance. It is not opposite to life but completion of it, fulfillment of the cycle that began with birth and must, inevitably, end with return to stillness. You looked around at the spirits dwelling in this place, and you understood that they were not suffering, were not lost or trapped or condemned. They were simply resting, deeply and completely, having laid down the burden of maintaining individual existence, having released the constant effort of being someone, of doing something, of moving toward goals and away from threats. They had earned this peace through living, had paid for this rest through the effort of existing, and now they could simply be, could exist without purpose beyond existence itself. The lesson Helheim offers, Hel said, rising and turning to face you fully, is not about dying but about living. It teaches that rest is not failure, that stopping is not weakness, that endings are not tragedies but natural completions, that the peace you see here, the ultimate peace of having finished, can inform how you live, can remind you that you don't need to live as though you're trying to avoid death, as though if you just keep moving fast enough, keep achieving enough, keep becoming enough, you can somehow escape the inevitable rest that awaits all living things. She placed a hand on your shoulder, and the touch was cool but not cold, final but not harsh. Death will come when it comes. But you are not dead yet, and you can carry this peace back with you, can remember that rest is sacred, that endings are necessary, that you don't need to fear the stillness that will eventually claim you, because that stillness is not loss but completion, not tragedy but fulfillment, not annihilation but transformation into a state that is as valid and valuable as the state of living. The breath of Yggdrasil began to stir, and you understood that your time in Helheim was ending, that one final transition awaited, one final return to the world tree itself, to the heart of all the realms, to the place where this journey had begun and where it would conclude. Go with peace, Hel said, releasing your shoulder, stepping back. And when you return to life, to the world of motion and change and constant becoming, remember this place. Remember that rest awaits, that you don't need to fear it, that ending is as natural as beginning, and that in the meantime, while you live, you can honor the principle of rest, can allow yourself to stop, to be still, to cease striving long enough to simply exist, to taste while living the peace that will be yours completely when living is done. And then Yggdrasil's breath surrounded you completely, lifting you from the shore of that quiet lake, carrying you upward and inward, toward the center, toward the heart, toward the final stage of your journey through the 9 realms, carrying with you now the wisdom of all you had experienced, Asgard's peace, Midgard's groundedness, Vanaheim's abundance, Alfheim's inner light, Jotunheim's patience, Nidavellir's creative focus, Svartalfheim's trusting darkness, and now Helheim's ultimate stillness, all of it woven together, all of it integrated, preparing you for the return, for the completion, for whatever transformation would occur when all these teachings combined, when the world tree wove them into wholeness and sent you back to your life profoundly changed, deeply blessed, carrying the peace of 9 realms within a single heart. Returning to Yggdrasil's heart. The ascent from Helheim was like waking from deep sleep, gradual, gentle, carrying with you the peace of that ultimate rest even as consciousness returned, even as awareness expanded once more beyond the profound stillness you had experienced. You felt yourself rising through layers that were not quite physical, not quite spatial, but more like states of being, like stages of awakening, like the slow emergence from depths into light. And as you rose, you became aware that you were gathering something, accumulating something, as though each realm you had visited had given you a gift that you now carried, as though the teachings and peace and wisdom you had received were not abstract concepts but tangible presences, actual substances that had weight and texture and could be held, could be integrated, could become permanent parts of your being rather than temporary experiences that would fade with time. From Asgard, you carried golden stillness, the understanding that even the highest existence required rest, that peace was not weakness but strength, that there was no shame in stopping, in simply being rather than constantly doing. From Midgard, you carried grounded presence, the remembering of how to live in harmony with natural rhythms, how to move at a pace that suited your nature rather than one imposed by external demands, how to find contentment in ordinary existence when ordinary was approached with mindfulness and care. From Vanaheim, you carried abundant trust, the knowing that the world wanted to nourish you, that scarcity was often illusion created by wrong relationship, that when you gave and received properly, participated in the cycles of mutual support, flourishing was natural rather than exceptional. From Alfheim, you carried inner luminosity, the vision of your own essential light, the truth that beneath all accumulated layers, you were fundamentally clear, fundamentally whole, fundamentally unbroken regardless of what experiences had touched you, what stories you had told yourself about your nature. From Jotunheim, you carried patient vastness, the perspective that allowed you to see your concerns in proper scale, to understand that urgency was often self-created, that time was more expansive than fear suggested, that moving slowly was not failure but often wisdom, often the only way to allow proper depth and development. From Nidavellir, you carried creative focus, the satisfaction that came from making rather than just consuming, from contributing beauty and meaning to the world, from spending your time and attention on craft, on creation, on leaving traces of care and quality that would persist beyond your presence. From Svartalfheim, you carried mysterious shadow, the trust that not everything needed to be understood, that darkness was not enemy but ally, that some things were better left in mystery, allowed to develop unseen, protected by shadow that nurtured rather than obscured. From Helheim, you carried ultimate stillness, the acceptance of endings as natural rather than tragic, the understanding that rest would come when it came, that fearing death was pointless and that embracing the principle of rest while living enriched existence rather than diminishing it. All of this you carried, and as you rose through the world tree's vast structure, these gifts began to weave together, to combine and reinforce each other, to create something greater than the sum of their parts, a complete teaching, a whole understanding, a state of being that integrated all you had learned into a unified awareness that would change how you moved through the world, how you related to yourself and others, how you experienced existence itself. The passage opened into the heart space you had left so long ago, or perhaps only moments ago, for time in Yggdrasil's embrace moved according to need rather than fixed measurement. The chamber was exactly as you remembered it, the walls glowing with gentle radiance, the pool at its center reflecting light that came from everywhere and nowhere, creating the sense of being held within something vast and caring, something that had guided your journey and now welcomed your return. And standing beside the pool was a presence, not a person exactly, not a god or spirit or being in any conventional sense, but something more fundamental, more essential. This was Yggdrasil's consciousness made manifest, the world tree's awareness given form enough to communicate, to acknowledge, to bless. The presence was neither male nor female, either young nor old, either one thing nor another but all things simultaneously, containing multitudes, expressing unity. When they spoke, if speaking was the right word for the communication that occurred, their voice was the whisper you had heard at the beginning, the breath that had carried you through all 9 realms, the gentle presence that had held you safe throughout your journey. "Welcome home, traveler," they said, and in those simple words you felt complete acceptance, complete recognition of what you had experienced and how you had been changed by it. You have walked the 9 realms and received their gifts. You have learned what each has to teach. And now you carry within you the wisdom of the world tree itself, the understanding that comes from experiencing all aspects of existence, from seeing how they connect, how they support each other, how they weave together into a whole that is greater and more beautiful than any single part. The presence gestured to the pool, and you moved to its edge, looking into water that now showed not the 9 realms separately but all of them simultaneously, overlaid and interpenetrating, demonstrating how they existed not in isolation but in relationship, not as separate locations but as different expressions of the same underlying reality, all of them held in Yggdrasil's branches, all of them connected by the tree's roots, all of them part of the pattern, part of the web, part of the great unity that only appeared as multiplicity from certain limited perspectives. The 9 realms exist within you, the presence said. They always have. The journey you have taken was not through external space but through your own interior landscape, through aspects of your own consciousness that you had forgotten or never known existed, through capacities and understandings that were always available but which required the right conditions, the right guidance, the right invitation to be accessed and integrated. They touched the water, and ripples spread across the surface, distorting the reflected realms, showing how what appeared fixed was actually fluid, what seemed separate was actually connected, what looked permanent was actually constantly changing, constantly moving, constantly transforming while maintaining essential patterns, essential relationships, essential truth beneath the surface variations. You return now to your life, the presence continued, to the world you left when you answered the whisper, when you accepted the invitation to walk through the realms. But you do not return unchanged. You carry with you the peace of 9 worlds, the wisdom of countless ages, the understanding that comes from seeing existence from multiple perspectives, from experiencing how different aspects of reality relate to each other, support each other, create together the vast web in which all beings are embedded, through which all experiences are connected. The breath of Yggdrasil began to intensify around you, and you understood that the final transition was beginning, that you were being prepared to return to ordinary consciousness, to regular existence, to the life you had been living before this journey began. When you wake, the presence said, their voice becoming softer, beginning to fade as the breath grew stronger, you will remember this. You will carry it with you. And when life becomes difficult, when challenges arise, when you forget the peace you have found here, you need only touch this, and you felt the medallion from Nidavellir warm against your chest, felt it become not just object but anchor, not just reminder but actual connection to everything you had experienced, and you will remember. You will return, in consciousness if not in body, to the world tree's embrace, to the 9 realms peace, to the truth that beneath all surface chaos and complexity, you are held, you are supported, you are part of something vast and beautiful and enduring. The breath surrounded you completely now, and you felt yourself being lifted, being carried, being moved through dimensions that had no names, through transitions that existed beyond space, through changes that transformed without destroying. That brought you back to where you started but profoundly different from how you had been, blessed by realms beyond the ordinary, touched by wisdom older than time, carrying peace that would persist through whatever came next. The presence's final words followed you as you moved, the world tree whispers always. Its breath moves through all things. And whenever you need guidance, whenever you seek peace, whenever you wish to remember what you have learned, simply be still, simply listen, and you will hear it, the gentle voice that connects all things, that weaves all realms into unity, that reminds you that you are never alone, never lost, never beyond the reach of the great pattern that holds all existence in its embrace. And then you were waking, or perhaps you had never slept, perhaps you had been somewhere beyond sleep, beyond waking, in a state that partook of both and neither. But you were opening your eyes, becoming aware of your body, feeling yourself present in ordinary reality once more, but carrying with you everything you had received, everything you had learned, everything you had become during your journey through the 9 realms. The world around you looked the same room, same light, same ordinary reality. But you were different. You were changed. You carried 9 forms of peace within you, integrated into your being, available whenever needed, accessible through memory, through intention, through simple willingness to remember what the world tree had shown you, what the realms had taught you, what the journey had revealed about the nature of existence and your place in it. And somewhere, beyond perception but not beyond awareness, you could still feel it, the breath of Yggdrasil, moving through all things, connecting all beings, weaving the great web that held everything in relationship, in pattern, in the vast and beautiful unity that existed beneath all apparent separation. The whisper continued, would always continue, waiting for those ready to hear it, ready to accept the invitation, ready to walk the 9 realms and discover the peace that waited in each one, that combined into wholeness, that transformed those who received it, that sent them back to ordinary life carrying extraordinary gifts, peace and wisdom and understanding that would change everything, that would make life richer, deeper, more connected to the vast web of existence in which all beings dwelt, through which all things were related, within which ultimate peace was not just possible but inevitable, not just hoped for but guaranteed, not just sought but found, again and again, by all who remembered to listen, to trust, to follow the whisper that called them home to the world tree's heart, where all things were one, where all peace was gathered, where all who journeyed found rest, found wisdom, found the truth that had been waiting within them all along, simply needing the right journey. To reveal it, to make it conscious, to allow it to transform a life, a heart, a way of being in the world. Sleep well, dear traveler. The world tree holds you still. Its whisper continues in your heart. And peace, the peace of 9 realms, lives within you now. Always present. Always available. Always calling you home. Rest in that knowing. Rest in that peace. Rest in Yggdrasil's eternal embrace. All is well. All is connected. All is one.